Good afternoon, and thank you all so much for being here today for this discussion on teaching for statesmanship with two outstanding teachers of statesmanship, Shilo Brooks from Princeton and Michael Promisel from the Catholic University of America. My name is Hans Zeiger, and I'm the president of the Jack Miller Center for Teaching America's Founding Principles and History. We believe that university scholars fill an essential role in sustaining American constitutional self-government. With that in mind, we aim to do three things: build and empower a network of university professors who teach the foundational ideas and documents of the American political tradition, forge new models for university-based training of K-12 teachers, and build a diverse coalition of leaders, scholars, and teachers to ignite a civics renaissance in America. Well, this week is Civic Learning Week. A number of civics organizations and educators are taking this week to share resources and host forums on what it takes for us to be an educated and informed citizenry. I'll say more on that in a moment, but first let me introduce our panelists. Shilo Brooks is Executive Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions and lecturer in the Department of Politics at Princeton University. He is the author of Nietzsche's Culture War. His teaching and research interests lie in the history of political philosophy, politics and literature, and statesmanship. He was previously Associate Faculty Director of the Benson Center for the Study of Western Civilization and Faculty Director of the Engineering Leadership Program at the University of Colorado. He received his PhD in political science from Boston College, and you may have seen an article featuring Dr. Brooks in the Free Press last year entitled "This Cowboy Wants to Teach Princeton Kids About Greatness." The full class title was "The Art of Statesmanship in the Political Life," very, very pertinent to what we're going to be talking about here today. And I should mention that Shilo hails originally from Texas. Dr. Michael Promisel is an assistant professor of politics at the Catholic University of America. His teaching and research examine ancient, medieval, and American traditions of political thought and ask timely questions concerning statesmanship, among other topics. He is currently working on a book manuscript titled "Prudence and Political Rule." He holds a BA from the University of Virginia and a PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He hails from Virginia originally. So welcome to both of you. I should note that both Dr. Brooks and Dr. Promisel are members of the Jack Miller Center's academic network, and both of them are making a tremendous difference in their work, both as teachers as well as what I like to call academic entrepreneurs, people who are not just doing good scholarship, but building things and developing programs on their campuses as hubs of influence on the academic landscape. Both of them are teaching the subject of statesmanship every day, and that's what we're going to discuss in our time together. So I wanted to start by defining terms. I've often heard people use the word statesman in contrast to the word politician. And I have an interest in this because I'm a recovering politician. But I often hear this, statement: we need more statesmen and fewer politicians. So I wonder if you could spend just a moment helping us understand the roots of this term and what it means. How does statesmanship relate to politics? What is statesmanship? Dr. Brooks, I'll turn to you first.
Yeah, so this is a real hard question. You open with the hardest possible question, but one of the things I like to do in my class is just look at the word, just write the word statesman on the board. It seems to me this could mean a few different things. One is it could mean a man who is the state. That seems not to be what people mean when they talk about statesmanship. A man who is the state. That would be something like tyranny or despotism. So I think we can rule that one out. You could say something like a man of the state, but that seems to be someone who's produced by the state for state purposes. That seems to lean more in the direction of something like socialism. I don't know that people have that in mind either. But I think another meaning, and maybe this one gets us closer to why we talk about a statesman, is a man for the state. A man who's in service of the state somehow, who's not the state himself, who's not necessarily even of it in the sense that he was produced by it, but is produced by the civil society which the state enables and cultivates. And in that sense, people often think of people like Lincoln, people like Washington, who were men in service of or for the state. I think the most basic definition, or at least the one that has currency in a lot of the circles in which I traffic, would be something like statesmanship is the exercise of prudence. There has to be prudence in there. It can't just be a kind of cold bureaucrat who's going by the book, who has instructions for how they're to carry out and execute orders. So the exercise of prudence is involved, and principle. that statesmanship requires not just prudence, but principle, that you have some guiding articulation of governing philosophy, which you deploy and which you can articulate at any given moment. And all of this exercise of prudence, this exercise of principle happens, and this is perhaps most important, within the bounds of the law. Statesmen seem not to be people who violate the law, who go outside the law. Now, there are exceptions, and we can talk about the greatness of a man like Lincoln, who in a way suspends the Constitution to save the Constitution. But in general, it's the exercise of prudence and principle within the boundaries of the law, and this is the final thing I'll say, for the sake of the common good. It's not for the sake of oneself, it's for the sake of the common good. So that seems to me to be at least a starting definition of what statesmanship is and how to think about it. And then we can take that and apply it to different people who were statesmen in the past to try to enrich it and put flesh on those bones.
Michael Promisel, how do you define statesmanship?
Well, I think Shiloh's got us off to a great start. And I'll just start where you did, Hans. I think colloquially, most of us make sense of the idea that a statesman somehow rises above the politician. You know, the late Queen Elizabeth, in a 2021 speech to the UN Climate Conference, asked the attendees to, quote, rise above the moment and practice statesmanship. You know, so it's not just the theorists who recognize this rising above. I think the balance of prudence and principle and service of the common good is all exactly right. I'll just note two further points about the origins and maybe some of the more sticky points about statesmanship in the course of the tradition of thinking about this. First, statesmanship often or maybe even exclusively occurs in the highest offices of polity. And so we think about presidents, prime ministers, maybe a few generals, and that's all well and good. But in some sense, statesmanship is distinct from and can even overshadow good old-fashioned everyday leadership. So there's been various political thinkers who have thought about this dilemma of statesmanship relative to everyday politics. Statesmanship is somehow bound to great times and great moments and great opportunities. That leads to the second point, which is in modern political thought, statesmanship has a little bit of an awkward relationship to constitutionalism. As Shilo said, staying within the bounds of the law is immensely important, but the most capable individuals, as we know from Lincoln's Lyceum address, those of towering genius and grand ambition, often want to transcend the law in order to prove their own greatness. And so in some sense, we're dealing with volatile ingredients in some sense when we talk about statesmanship. There's some classic cases, Alcibiades, Julius Caesar are probably some of the most famous from the ancient world. But Lincoln himself was sensitive to this and is has moments of self-reflection that I think are quite revealing. So another point to discuss with our students is whether a political community that depends upon statesmanship is somehow hampered by too much of a dependence.
So since it's Civic Learning Week, let me ask you both, why should we focus on a topic like statesmanship during Civic Learning Week or any time for that matter? I suppose another way we could ask the question is this: is the teaching of statesmanship an important part of civic education? And we might add a civic education in America. And I'll start with you, Dr. Promisel.
Well, you know, Hans, when I introduce myself and my work at Christmas parties and, you know, meeting people, I have an easy time convincing people that it's worth thinking about in our times. Statesmanship, leaders who are prudent and work for the common good. I think the first reason is the most obvious reason, which is when we're dissatisfied with the current state of leadership in various ways, we want to turn to look for better options. Another reason why it's an important part of civic education is because it's our history. You can know the events of 1776, of 1865, of 1941 from an historical perspective, but when we invite our students into the drama of the great odds faced by the American colonists, or the great grip of slavery on the Southern mind, or the terror of totalitarian government in World War II, you appreciate the majesty that is governing during such trying and troubled waters. And any student who's got any ambition or appreciation for something beyond themselves is often enamored, as I was as a young man, by these great figures who are able to navigate these waters. And I think the binding of civic history and traditions with an appreciation for our leaders brings us all into the great drama that is our national story.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I only would add, and I think this is part of some of what we were saying with the previous question, is one of the things that the study of statesmanship does, and whether this is merely a civic effect or how this plays into civic education would be worth thinking about, is that it calls our minds to the highest human possibilities. You know, that is to say, a statesman would be someone who's a human being in full. And in that sense, they're the fullest instantiation, perhaps, of what the regime or the polity can produce. I think it's a worthy exercise and an extraordinary invitation for students to be able to reflect on the heights of the type of human being that the regime can produce and that it needs to sustain and perpetuate itself justly. And so for that reason, I think that we should focus on on statesmanship during Civic Learning Week and just in civic education more generally, because it's a macrocosm of the microcosm of the citizen, him or herself. So I think that's important. And I would also say, I think, you know, statesmanship is an important part of civic education when civic education is understood more broadly as liberal education. And Hans, I know you wrote an article in National Affairs in which you discussed the education of a statesman, and there was a quotation in there from a letter to Hamilton, which I had not seen before. I was really taken by, and in fact, I'm going to steal it for my own work, just so you know. I'm going to read that because I think it really illuminates this question. It's just a sentence, and you say that in a letter to Hamilton in 1796, Washington identified education as, quote, one of the surest means of enlightening and giving just ways of thinking to our citizens. And then you say, like Cicero before him, he advocated for leaders of the Republic a liberal education, one, quote, by which the arts, sciences, and letters could be taught in their fullest extent. This occurs to me as crucial to an understanding for what statesmanship is and what the education of a statesmanship consists in, and therefore, in a way, to Civic Learning Week more broadly, liberal education, insofar as it liberates our minds in a liberal regime, it liberates our minds from conviction in order to think freely, is itself civic education, or at least consists in part of a kind of civic education. And so I was sort of astonished to see a statesman, George Washington, recommending for the health of the American regime liberal education. So I think that that's a beautiful quotation that really brings our theme today, statesmanship, together with questions about what civic education consists in.
If I could,
Go ahead, Michael.
could I just add one more thing? I think it's also in our basic self-interest. You know, we know not when the next crisis will be upon us, and a citizenry and a Republican form of government must be able to appreciate, to elect, to support, and to give latitude to the greatest of our leaders during times of great need, you know. And fortunately, I think we've done a pretty decent job of that so far, but if we want to pass the torch on, so to speak, it's in our immediate interest as a nation to perpetuate conversation about this mode of activity.
Great. I want to delve into the methods that you use to teach statesmanship, but before we do that, let's talk about your own journeys as scholars and teachers. Of all the things that you could have decided to study and to teach, how did you come to take up the study and teaching of statesmanship, Dr. Promisel?
Well, I want to use this as a moment to just pause and say thank you to the Jack Miller Center. It was in a class sponsored by the Jack Miller Center and a postdoc under the tutelage of Jim Caesar at the University of Virginia, where I was introduced to the topic of statesmanship, the reading of primary texts from Abraham Lincoln, that my life just transformed. And ever since I took that class, I went from wanting to be a statesman to wanting to learn more, to delve into its depths, and to appreciate the great tradition that is studying it and teaching it. So I owe thanks to Hans and his organization and all the supporters. It really was right in that classroom experience for me that it all clicked.
Great. Shilo, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I was a young person, and I'm still a young person of tremendous ambition. And so one of the things that moved me was gazing at men of ambition and beholding their luster and envying it and wanting to admire it, and wanting to emulate it. And I have no shame. I think that's perfectly natural. In fact, I think that that's quite healthy. And so for me, it was, the study of ambition led me to admire greatness, and not just the greatness of a Napoleon or of a Caesar, but what a teacher of mine named Robert Faulkner, who wrote a book on greatness called The Case for Greatness, Honorable Ambition and Its Critics, the kind of greatness he called honorable, which is the sort of greatness of the magnanimous man in Aristotle or something like this, a greatness, as we talked about earlier, that subsists within the bounds of the law, that lusts for distinction, but distinction that's deserved and that's conferred by the wise, not the vulgar. So it's a person who wants to be worthy, who seeks honor and wants to be worthy of high honors from high and knowing and wise people. And so I think for me, that led me to think about the difference between statesmanship and mere fame seeking, or honor loving and fame seeking, and those sorts of things. And I would say the other thing is, I grew up in Texas, everybody's got a Southern accent. A lot of the people who I was introduced to in history didn't sound like that. They sound like East Coast elites and these sorts of things. But when I was young, in 1992, Bill Clinton was elected president, and I had never seen somebody from Arkansas. Think what you want about Bill Clinton. This is not me, saying Bill Clinton's the greatest. It's saying that I was, 16 years old, and there was a guy in the Oval Office from Arkansas with a Southern accent who had the most genial and affable way of talking to people that sounded like a guy on your back porch. And it was then that I started to see that, anybody in America can go sort of become, I was young, I wasn't familiar with it, but that anybody can go be president of the United States, and that all sorts of people in the country have access to this sort of thing. And so I saw somebody like myself there, and I was thinking about honor and greatness. And I think those are the kinds of things, combined with the deep reading of the great books at a school called St. John's, that got me interested in this topic.
Perfect. So, what are some of the key elements of an education in statesmanship? My sense is that it's a mix of intentional intellectual preparation through formal means, and as well as informal study. I mean, you think of somebody like an Abraham Lincoln, who had very little formal education, but certainly prepared himself in a very intentional way, as well as learning through experience. You might learn through experience at one level of leadership, and that prepares you for a higher level of leadership. Am I right about that as a general matter? Are there other things I'm leaving off of that list? What do you see as the essential building blocks of preparation for statesmanship? Shilo, go ahead.
Oh, okay. So to me, and one of the things that I harp on the most, and this is now, it may sound very odd, but curiosity about the world is arguably, to me, the cultivation of curiosity, the most important feature of an education in statesmanship and its preparation, other than, or in addition to, practical preparation. But what I have in mind there is this: if you assume a position of leadership at any political level, whether it's mayor, president, or a non-political level, whether you're the CEO or president of an organization, there will be things that come to your desk, the character of which was wholly unknown to you prior to them landing on your desk. It's totally unpredictable what will happen in this country tomorrow, in this economy tomorrow, in your restaurant tomorrow, right? And so the only way to prepare yourself for the unpredictability that comes your way in a position of leadership is to be widely curious about the world. One of the people I teach in my course is Sandra Day O'Connor, And she used to talk about the way in which the things that land on a Supreme Court justice's desk are many and various. Today, it's some law about medicine. Tomorrow, it's taxes. The next day, it's the question of who should be elected president of the United States, Bush or Gore. Then it's affirmative action. Then it's abortion. Then it's something about trade. The kind of intellectual athleticism that you have to deal with a variety of unforeseeable challenges in a position of leadership is extraordinary. And so you need a wide-ranging curiosity sustained over the course of a life. That seems very, very important to me, supplemented by giving thought to attention to character. What does it mean to be a person of character? What does it mean to be a person of substance? In what does the substance of character consist? This goes back to the difference between a statesman merely and a politician. A statesman would certainly be someone who's a person of character. So that seems to me to be important. And then I would say participation in the institutions of civic life is really important. I'm astonished to be able to teach at the university where I do. I have a student in one of my classes right now who is mayor of his hometown. You know, it's a small town. And he got to be in mayor because he was on the library board, and the mayor got into some hot water, and there was really nobody else because it's not like there's a whole lot of people in local politics, and the kid's 20 years old sitting in my class is a mayor. And so I think, you know, that kind of thing from a very young age, being involved, who knows what will land in your lap, but that kind of experience in practical politics combined with an intellectual curiosity and an attention to questions about character is the best preparation you can have for an endeavor which is ultimately, whose nature ultimately is unknowable.
Michael, what do you see as the essential building blocks of preparation for statesmanship?
I think Shiloh's got so much of the right ingredients. I think something else that you said, Hans, is it's a very practical undertaking in many ways. And just like any other art or excellence, it requires an apprenticeship, you know, being an intern on the Hill and working for your local mayor. And those kinds of things are immensely enriching because they train our attention. And if we maintain a spirit of curiosity along the way, we'll be the kind of student who picks up on the cues and the real causes of action and change and reform that work. But I think another thing to emphasize in a conversation about teaching is that we as the teachers of civic history are ourselves a model of the statesman in many ways. We are the vehicle by which the tradition comes to our students. And so we need to live out the very virtues that we want to instill in our students. You know, it wasn't Lincoln's Lyceum address that started my interest. It was the fact that I could not figure out the politics of this professor who stood in front of me and was clearly so brilliant because he had no interest in teaching his personal opinions. That was, to my 18-year-old self in a college classroom, I thought it was all about whatever your own personal opinion, you know. So what enchanted me was the teacher. And so I think, you know, I would love to sit in Shiloh's class. He's full of energy and curiosity and everything. And insofar as we can, as teachers, mimic those attributes for our students and show them that the material we are talking about is really, truly great. And if we deliver that with a sour or a dull face, why would they believe us?
Is there a room for, you know, I think we tend to think of stateswomen occupying roles like the presidency. Shilo, when you mention Justice O'Connor, makes me think there are a variety of offices, certainly in our national government, where perhaps the qualities of statesmanship can be demonstrated. But also in a federalist republic like we are, you have most of the opportunities for public service at the state and local levels. Is there a way in which statesmanship can be exhibited in less famous, less national, you know, sort of ways, particularly in a society like ours that depends on leadership being demonstrated in many different state and local offices?
Yeah, I don't see why not. I mean, that's the beauty of our country, the wide variety of local offices in particular, from, you know, various boards, school boards, et cetera, to other local offices, allocating resources to schools and after-school programs and whatever the case may be. There's no question in my mind, just as somebody who leads a small organization, that just because you're not at, the presidential level, that you can exhibit those qualities, and not just that you must, in order to succeed. One of the people I mean, this is now going back to the grander figures, but I think the example illustrates itself well. My definition of statesmanship is a lot more encompassing than I think, most people. So, when you asked me the question at the beginning, I gave you a kind of, conventional definition of the man of the state, working by prudence and principle on behalf of the common good. But one of the people who I teach in my course and who I've taught, in fact, at the various civics programs for teachers that I've been lucky enough to be a part of at the Jack Miller Center, is Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass never held elected office. Frederick Douglass was not of the race that could hold elected office during his lifetime. But I argue, and I will take it to my grave, that Frederick Douglass is an example of a statesman. He doesn't exert or exercise statesmanship from elected office, though. He's shaping a conversation with speeches, just like a president would, with deeds. His own son served in the Civil War. Just like a man of the state would. I think the same is true of somebody like Dr. King, right? That there's a sense in which certain virtues of statesmanship are exhibited exterior to political office, which nonetheless shape and give contour to the political conversation. And so I think the virtues of statesmanship and the qualities of character and intellectual curiosity, magnanimity, and seriousness that I've advocated for today are applicable not just at the state and local level, not just at the federal level, but in all sorts of occupations, from business to civil rights activists to principal of the school, you name it. And that's why I think that reading about the lives of great statesmen, the wisdom and their judgment, can affect all sorts of people and all sorts of professions, young people, old people, and everything in between.
Right, not just in politics, but leadership roles across.
Exactly right.
That's great. Michael Promisel, how does an education in statesmanship differ across regimes, or are there some common topics that should be of universal interest to statesmen and women?
Well, as Shilo said earlier, there are certainly common principles that ought to be taught. What does it mean to be a virtuous person? What is the common good? But I think we've touched a lot on those already. So I do want to say that there's a lot of particularity in leading. Steeping oneself in the traditions, the institutions, and the limitations that are exerted wisely within one's community is deeply important to stay within the bounds that we've been speaking about all along as an essential attribute of statesmanship. I think there's reason why in modern and ancient examples, when the outsiders come in and presume to govern a community with no experience or concern for those traditions and those particularities, disastrous consequences often ensue. And so I think there is no problem. In fact, it is our great civic duty to take pride in our own civic tradition, to look to our founders, to read and hear the speeches of Frederick Douglass and the struggle for civil rights, and so that we are prepared by the distinct traditions and ways that our country has navigated these in the past. There are differences, absolutely.
Dr. Brooks, how were you able to attract 250 students to your class on the art of statesmanship and political life at Princeton? What made that one of the most popular classes in one of the most prestigious Ivy League institutions? What is causing students to say, that's what I can study right now?
I get that question a lot, and I don't know. I mean, I'll give you some hunches. I'll give you some conjecture. One of the things, of course, is that Princeton is a place where there are a lot of ambitious people. So I met my people. I met my crowd. I'm the right man in the right place, the right time. So that's one of them. But that's a particular thing. And I think that the message of the class isn't just geared to, these ambitious students who you'd find here, but it's suitable for a lot of people, and it's resonated with a lot of people. As you mentioned, the profile's been written, and I'm writing a book on. I mean, it's kind of a universal message. I think the thing that attracts the students is that I begin the course and really sustain this throughout with a look at the interior life of the statesman. What does it mean I begin with their ambition. They see the luster of greatness that I saw as a young person, and they want it, and they don't know why they want it. And so I try to get them to examine why they want it, to subject their own longings to cross-examination. But I do that by way of introducing them to writings by people who have themselves been statesmen in some capacity and lived to tell about it. So by virtue of examining the interior lives of the people that they want to be like, they're given an occasion to examine their own interior lives. Why do you want to be great? What is it that you hope to get from ambition? What are the ends and objects of your ambition, and are they worthwhile? Will it make you happy to achieve the things that you want to achieve? And are those things really valuable? And so to call into question those things, and to say to the students just very simply, why do you want the adulation of others? It seems like part of what you're attracted to is people clapping for you, people voting for you, the praise that you would get when you walk into the room and you're in charge, right? The feeling that. So I take the kind of deepest psychological features that oftentimes we're too embarrassed to talk about and admit, and hold them out in front of a light and shine a microscope on them and say, this is you. Let's look at the beautiful as well as the ugly. And I think just that kind of frankness, combined with the reading of books that move the heart, not textbooks, but real books that move the soul, written by flesh and blood people who have lived the life. One of the requirements for the text in the course is that I will admit no text that has not been written by someone who did not serve in a capacity of statesmanship. So, you philosophers can get the heck out of here. Now, that's not necessarily true, because there are some people who have been philosophers and statesmen at the same time who I can talk about. But nonetheless, I begin from the starting point of statesmanship. And I think that people that's a kind of a fresh approach. And it's an approach that encourages you not just to take the subject of the course matter as academic curiosity, but as an occasion to reflect on yourself and alter your own soul and examine your own soul and live in according to principles which you found through self-examination. We're not just writing scholarly articles here. This is about your life. Yeah. And I think that that's what gets people interested.
So why the heck don't college students have more of an opportunity to take classes like that one? I mean, it occurs to me that a whole lot of students, when they decide that they're going to be a political science major or history major, they want to understand something about leadership, and particularly in our setting, in a free society. And why don't they have more opportunities to take classes like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I don't want to dominate here, but I think you put it pretty well in your article, that there's been a calcification of the academic social sciences, such that what ends up happening when you take courses in a lot of the academic social sciences is that you take courses on how to become a political scientist. That might be appropriate for graduate students, but it's not appropriate for undergraduates. And so I think there's kind of a failure on our part to meet students where we are. PhDs are ejected from graduate school a lot of the time with research brains. They just wrote a dissertation, right? And this can be true at the K-12 level too, where the substance is not taught, but rather theories about education are taught. So, I mean, I think this is an equal criticism. But my point here is that there's a kind of notion that the purpose of a political science department is to train future members of the political science profession. You in your article and me in my class wind the clock back to an earlier view of what the study of politics means, which is just reflection on the good, reflection on the common good, reflection on the nature of the civic enterprise, of the polity. Those questions have in some ways been lost. And so, of course, I wouldn't, if I were an ambitious person and I found myself in a course where we were reading a bunch of articles from the American Political Science Review, that would, I mean, I hate to say it, it would bore me to tears. But if I'm in a course where I'm reading the autobiography of Sandra Day O'Connor in her youth, or Frederick Douglass as a slave, or Theodore Roosevelt post-presidency, that's alive to me. And so I think we need a kind of restoration and rethinking of what education in universities and the social sciences, at least at the introductory level, really means and ought to be.
Yeah. Michael Promisel, what kinds of classroom and teaching methods do you use in your own teaching of statesmanship there at Catholic University of America and other places that you've had opportunities to teach this?
Well, the wonderful thing about this subject, as we've sort of been hinting at all along, is it's a great opportunity to defy disciplinary binoculars. So I use the arts, I use literature, I use dramatic productions all the time in my classes. So my class on statesmanship this semester, my students just watch A Man for All Seasons, which began as a play and a movie in the 60s about Thomas More and his navigation of the closing years of his life as Lord Chancellor of England. And the reason why these dramatic and literary presentations, the plays of Shakespeare, are so impactful, I think, is because they throw our students into the drama of the situation. Just as Shilo was saying, the conceptual abstract study does nothing to elicit our interest and attention and keep us up late into the night wanting to read to see how this figure navigated that situation, like the true, real, almost unbelievable events that so many of our predecessors have navigated. And that allows the teacher of this subject to pull from everything. I mean, it's said that Lincoln loved reading Euclid. Well, why don't you have your students read it and see why? What was there? That's not something you'd expect in a leadership class, but these kinds of interdisciplinary things. The other thing I'll say is we talk a lot about role models, not just the great and the historical, but in our lives, because whether we recognize it or not, our parents, our friends, our friendships, these shape our concretized sense of what it means to live well and to act well. And so we bring in the everyday, the social, and the friendly into conversation regularly.
How important, Shiloh, is the reading of primary texts in a proper understanding of statesmanship?
It's the
Talked about, a variety of media that can be used, role models, arts and literature. Talk about the role of primary texts. And I should just mention, we had a webinar with Diana Schaub a few weeks ago where she talked about, how the speeches of people like Washington and Lincoln, we were looking at the Lyceum Address, the farewell address, are actually manifestations of statesmanship, that through their words, they're trying to lead. But how important is that in the teaching of these topics?
I think it's supremely important. I just so people know, I don't have any non-primary sources on my syllabus. In other words, it's so important to me that I have deliberately curated the syllabus to only include such texts. I agree with Diana about the speeches and these sorts of things. I want to make a appeal for another kind of primary source text, which I've already mentioned in passing, which is the autobiography. I don't mean the biography. I mean the autobiography. And the reason I mean the autobiography is that there's something extraordinary when a person of tremendous substance and practical experience sits down with a pen to tell their lives back to themselves for the sake of other people. You get all sorts of interesting things that happen there. So they might share stories which you've never heard before. That's interesting. More interesting than that is that they might lie. In other words, a statesman, I mean, they're still politicians. So people will say, well, don't autobiographies really, they're just sort of like hagiography inflations. I consider that, first of all, I think that's not, so terribly common that it's debilitating. But second, I consider that a feature, not a bug. In other words, if a person wants to make themselves into something that they weren't, that's a piece of information for us to discuss. That's a feature of their psychology and maybe a feature of the psychology of political ambition as such, which is worth considering. So I think that autobiography pays all sorts of dividends insofar as it allows you to see the person's genuine voice. It also, if you read it well, allows you to see their concerns and their fears. But more than that, it allows you to live their life along with them. I often tell my students, you're boring, right? You get your one boring life. The only way that you can make yourself into the multitudinous being necessary to govern a nation or a state or even a large corporation is to take into yourselves the lives of many people who are richer than you are at 18, who hasn't seen anything. So go read Douglas's 3 autobiographies. Go read Teddy Roosevelt or Ulysses S. Grant autobiography and live with them through those primary sources. Hear their voices, the patterns of their writing, the passion of their speech. Imbibe those riches. And so I think that primary sources, whether it's speeches, whether it's autobiography, or just the great sources of the American and Western traditions from Plato to the Federalist Papers, are extremely important for students to read.
Speaking of primary sources, we have some questions in the Q&A box, and I'm going to go to one from Edward Blum. He asks, if you had to choose one primary source from the American Revolutionary era to have undergraduate students, not history majors, read, analyze, dig into, to think about statesmanship, honor, and becoming an honorable citizen. I'll turn to both of you for that. Whoever thinks of it first.
I can't begin to answer that question without first saying Washington's farewell address. I mean, it's long for some classroom settings, but here's the reflections of someone who has lived decades of power, and I think it can really be a defining moment for his students to encounter the words, prophetic words in many ways, of our first president leaving office. And if you tie that into some of Washington's revolutionary letters, you can see some major themes that he wants to pass on.
I would say, and Michael, I might need your help with this because I know this was a text featured in the class you took at UVA because I taught that class. But do you remember the exchange between Jefferson and Madison on whether the Constitution should be torn up every 19 years, which is what
Yes.
Jefferson says? And Madison's like, no, we need to venerate the Constitution, and therefore you cannot tear it up every 19 years and it cannot go from generation to generation. I think that those texts, and I just can't remember you could look up Jefferson tear up the Constitution every 19 years and find it. But I think that some of those early exchanges between Jefferson and Madison on the question of what a proper Constitution consists in and whether every generation has the right to govern itself, whether self-government means you write your own Constitution every 19 years, because if you're bound by your grandfather's Constitution, that ain't self-government. That's Jefferson's argument, where Madison sees the constitutions need veneration in order to maintain their authority. The exchanges between those two men at that crucial time are really, really amazing.
It's Fed 49 for Madison, and there's a 1789 letter from Jefferson to Madison about this subject. You're exactly right, Shilo. That did wonders for me as a student.
We have another question here from Jim Stoner from Louisiana State University. He says, success in American politics, at least electoral success, requires popularity, doesn't it? Particularly since the rise of mass media. But aren't what Publius called the vicious arts by which elections are too often carried at odds with the virtues that characterize statesmanship? We've had many popular, or for the time being popular, leaders in recent years, but who are the true statesmen among them? Can political greatness and celebrity coexist?
I will take this one to start. Professor Stoner is probably one of the leading people you can turn to in his work on this question. I'll just take a stab and say, this is why I said at the beginning, these are volatile ingredients, not just from the individual psychological level, but the institutional arrangements and especially the party politics that play into getting to the top of the electoral ladder can and often are, and perhaps now even more so than they have been in the history of our regime, be at odds with the rewards and incentive structure of being a statesman. And so it's it's a political science question to ask what setup or arrangement or processes of selection are most appropriate for elevating the type of people who are going to exercise these capacities. And on that topic, my advisor Jim Caesar's book, Presidential Selection and Theory and Development, is a wonderful contribution to reflect on how some things like the primary process that we have at present do not reward the very attributes that we've been talking about for the better part of an hour.
I would only add, I'm not an expert on this, and certainly Professor Stoner knows more about it than me, but I was looking over a book a few days ago, which was a contentious book, at its time, I think still is, Fame and the Founding Fathers by Adair. And I don't have a position on the book, and people agree with it and disagree with it, and other people would be much better to analyze it than me. But I did find some meaning in his distinction between fame, honor, and glory. That fame is given to a person by people who don't know what the good is, such that you can acquire fame for all sorts of outrageous or vulgar things, and people will make you famous on the basis of views about you that aren't in keeping with the true good. So the search for fame is the lowest thing. But honor, as I mentioned earlier, and this you find in the classical tradition too, Socrates, Plato, Xenophon, Aristotle, is bestowed, when it's rightly understood, by people of wisdom and knowledge upon people who truly merit it according to that wisdom and knowledge, such that honor is bestowed not by just everybody for just anything, but for noble things. And then glory is really, I mean, men seek it. Machiavelli talks about the longing for glory, but glory is really what's suited for God. Glory be to God. So glory is as dangerous in a way as fame. Fame is the vulgar currency. Glory, if you have someone who's in search of glory, they're in search of something that perhaps you don't want your leaders in search of. So it occurs to me that what this leaves us with is honor. And I wonder if there's not some way to rehabilitate honor. I think fame, as you rightly point out, has exploded as a means by which to platform yourself and exercise the arms of the state. But if there was some way to rehabilitate honor as a kind of mediating standard and desirable thing on the basis of genuine merits, that would be interesting. I don't have an answer for how that can happen in the contemporary world. I just was moved by those distinctions and framing the problem within them.
Yeah, it's fascinating to look at how the founders understood something like fame and how they understood honor versus glory and some of these things. Also worth reading Richard Brookhiser's biography of George Washington, just a short little biography called Founding Father, where he, I can't remember if he cites Douglas Adair's essay in that, but certainly some related topics, like the notion that the founding generation was part of an act for history to see, and just that there's a lot to unpack there from how people thought about what they were up to during that time period. We have a question here from Max Likens. Do you encounter students who are skeptical about ideas of greatness and statesmanship? If so, how do you go about trying to convince them that it's worthwhile to think about these concepts? Michael?
Skepticism abounds in different forms for me, as I've taught these at these classes in different institutions. And really, I think the point I made earlier is the point I'll say again, is that the true pedagogical tactic is to devote yourself to the study, to the curiosity and the investigation that you want to elicit out of your students. And you can make straight appeals to them, and I often do in the opening class of the year. But another attribute that I try and live out is one of truly open argumentation. I say to my students, if you're willing to make an argument grounded in the substance and material and ideas of this class, we'll hear you out in this class. And so long as you can sustain it and engage conversationally with respect, we will hear your points and we will contest them and we will argue them back. And so some of my students who will have various critiques through that argumentative process have to come up with substance to their own skepticism, which they might either go further into or perhaps find some weak points in.
Charlie?
Yeah, that's a good question. That was a really good answer. I mean, I don't know if I have more to add other than to say, I operate on the basis of a view of human nature, which says there's some longing for, I don't want to use the term greatness, but for distinction. There's some passion for distinction in all of us. So what I have to do with the skeptical student is uncover what that passion for distinction is. Now here it's pretty easy because they got into Princeton. And so they clearly have some sense that they're distinguished already. You can't argue with me. I know you think you're the best and prestigious, right? So I try to look at the person and see where they are and uncover a certain passion for distinction, which I've been given to understand by way of a study of, human interior life that spans from the ancient Greeks all the way up to modern political philosophy, exists in all of us, and expose that and peel the layers away like an onion, such that students come to see themselves in the books we read. The only other thing I would say is that a lot of the time for a skeptical student, that student might be ignorant and might be able to be, dare I say, overwhelmed with the true height and substance of an extraordinary statesman. So one of the things that I'll do is talk about, any number of people. I'll give you the example of Churchill. Churchill painted 344 canvases in his lifetime. His collected works are bigger than those of Shakespeare and Dickens combined, the two greatest English writers. He also happened to have been prime minister during the time of the greatest war in modern history. What have you done? Have you ever tried to paint one canvas? Have you ever tried to write one book? Have you ever tried to be prime minister for 1 week? So I think to feel the weight of the fullness of these people, and I can give you examples of all sorts of people who have lived that way, is it ought to bring someone to silence, if not perplexity. So that's a kind of steamroll way of dealing with this.
Last question I'll ask you guys. We've talked a lot about various sources that you teach in the classroom, primary sources, other kinds of materials. But if viewers of this webinar are looking for a great book to read for their own understanding of statesmanship, what would you recommend? Michael?
I'll start Harvey Mansfield's 1965 Statesmanship and Party Government. The reason why I recommend it is because there's a certain sense in which statesmanship is more limited. We are less dependent upon it in the modern world. And what Mansfield does in this book is shows how Edmund Burke was quite perceptive of that reality, and sort of in the spirit of Jim Stoner's question, recognize certain limitations that are rightly there in a constitutional system within the operation of party politics. And so for statesmanship in the present moment, that book is immensely instructive.
Yeah, I think it's hard to pick just one. I mean, if I had to pick just one, I would pick a book that rewards itself. It's like a desert island book. It rewards study over the course of a lifetime. The first time you read it, it's like, what is this? It's totally weird. The 10th time you read it, you feel like you found something that's a secret treasure only for you. And this is the book with which I begin my course and on which I deliver 11 consecutive lectures, and which is unheard of to spend that much time on a book. But it's a book by an ancient Greek philosopher who Jefferson recommended when he recommended young people read certain ancient sources, who Adams had read. And that's an ancient Greek philosopher named Xenophon, who's a student of Socrates, the other student of Socrates who you don't know, Plato's the one you do know, who wrote a book called The Education of Cyrus about the perfect political nature, the perfect young man. It's like he was created in a lab to be a great leader. And it's the story of Cyrus the Great, fictionalized, and it consists of his both his inner psychology and his acquisition of empire, and the way he changes, and the things that he thinks are just, and the things that he sees as good, and the cunning, and the ambition, and the romance, and all of the things. And I think that that's an extraordinary source on second or third reading. It's going to take some time to really see the well springs of the ancient world as they weigh this question of the political life and its character.
Michael Promisel and Shilo Brooks, thank you, gentlemen, very much for joining us for this webinar. And I hope that folks will keep in touch with us here at the Jack Miller Center. You can go on our website at jackmillercenter.org and feel free to reach out with your feedback on this and ideas for future webinars that we might do with members of our scholarly community. Thank you again, and hope everybody has a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Hans.